There is a strange paradox in the history of art. A man created more than 2,000 paintings during his lifetime. Yet when he died at the age of 37, almost no one knew his name. During his lifetime, most of his paintings were never sold. In fact, only a single painting is known to have been sold while he was still living, and only a few months after finishing his final works. He walked out into a wheat field with a gun in his hand. Today, those same paintings hang in some of the world's greatest museums. Each year, millions of people stand before them, gazing at swirling, star-filled skies, radiant yellow sunflowers, and wheat fields stretching all the way to the horizon. The man who painted those images was Vincent van Gogh. Yet the story of Vincent van Gogh is not simply the story of a painter. It is the story of a man who often felt out of place in the world. A man who once tried to become a minister, who lived among poor miners, who worked in art galleries before eventually discovering another path. The path of painting. He began painting relatively late in life. And once he began, he worked with a kind of intensity that seemed almost impossible to stop. In less than 10 years, Vincent created thousands of works. Paintings filled with bold color, brush strokes laid down thick and fast, skies that seem to move as though they are alive. To many people of his own time, his paintings looked strange. Some even believed they were too intense, too unusual. But as time passed, the world began to see them differently. Today, Vincent van Gogh is considered one of the most influential painters in the history of art. Yet, perhaps what makes his story so remarkable is not only the paintings themselves. It is the road that led to them. A road that passed through small villages in the Netherlands, through art galleries in Paris and London, through poor rented rooms, storms of the mind, and wide wheat fields beneath the summer sky of France. It is the story of a man who continued to paint even when he believed that almost no one truly understood him. So tonight, let the rhythm of the story slow down for a moment. Take a breath. Let the images of the 19th century drift gently into your mind. Quiet villages, wide open fields, and skies filled with stars guiding you gradually towards sleep. If stories like this bring a small sense of calm to your evening, you may choose to like the video, subscribe to the channel, or leave a small comment below. Your support helps these historical stories continue to be told. Thank you for spending this time here tonight. And as the story begins, we will return to a summer afternoon in the year 1890. An afternoon in a wheat field near a small village in France. The place where the life of Vincent van Gogh moved toward its final moment. This is the bedtime biography of Vincent van Gogh. Chapter 1. The Gunshot in the Wheat Field. Late in the afternoon of July 27th, 1890, the summer light settled gently over Auvers-sur-Oise in a soft golden haze. It was a small village north of Paris, where wheat fields stretched outward until they dissolved into the horizon. By the end of the 19th century, France was living through what would later be called the Belle Époque, a time when great cities like Paris pulsed with art, science, and industry. Yet less than an hour away by train villages like Auvers still moved at the quieter rhythm of an earlier century. Low stone houses, dusty roads, wheat fields ripening into gold. The wind passed through the fields in long, slow waves. When it rose, the wheat moved like the surface of the sea. When it softened again, each stalk stood still in the fading sunlight, glimmering faintly like thin sheets of metal. A man was walking along the narrow path that led toward the fields. He was tall and thin with a dark red beard. A wide-brimmed hat shielded his face from the sun. Over one shoulder he carried a wooden easel, and beneath his arm was a worn paint box. For the villagers, the sight had already become familiar over the past few weeks. They often saw him walking along this road in the morning or late afternoon, heading toward the open fields. The man was Vincent van Gogh. During his nearly 2 months in Auvers-sur-Oise, Vincent worked almost without rest. There were days when he finished a painting in only a few hours. Wheat fields, narrow roads, slanted rooftops, dark cypress trees standing quietly beneath vast skies. For Vincent, a landscape was never simply something to look at. It was something to feel. Light, wind, and color seemed to carry their own rhythm, and he tried to capture that rhythm with brush strokes that were thick, swift, and alive. That afternoon the sky was mostly clear. White clouds drifted slowly at a great height. There was no sign of rain, no hint of anything unusual. Vincent walked deeper into the wheat fields. Here the village behind him nearly disappeared from view. Only the vast sky above and the wide sea of wheat surrounding him remained. A narrow dirt path divided the field into small passages. From time to time, crows crossed the sky, letting out harsh cries before vanishing into the distance. This was where Vincent often painted. Many villagers had seen him working here. He would set down his easel, open his paint box, and begin painting with a speed that surprised them. There were few sketches, little hesitation. The brush went straight onto the canvas, thick and fast, almost urgent. Sometimes he stepped back a few paces, studied the painting for a moment, then continued again. Some said he painted as though time itself were moving too quickly. The weeks in Auvers became one of the most intense periods of creation in his life. In a little more than 2 months, Vincent painted more than 70 works. Wheat fields appeared again and again in those paintings, each time beneath a different sky, a different light, a different mood. But on the afternoon of July 27th, Vincent had not brought a large canvas with him. He stopped in the middle of the field. The wind still moved softly through the wheat. In the distance, a line of dark trees formed a faint border along the horizon. In the wide and quiet space, every sound seemed to grow clearer. The wind, the insects, the distant cry of a crow. And then another sound appeared, a short, sudden crack, not as loud as thunder, not long enough to echo, just a single dry report breaking across the field. Then everything returned to silence. The wind continued to move through the wheat. White clouds drifted slowly across the summer sky. No one in the village immediately understood what had happened. Some time later, a man appeared on the dirt road, leading from the fields back toward Auvers. He walked slowly, his body slightly bent forward. Each step seemed heavier than the one before. It was still Vincent. But this time he was not carrying his easel. The bullet had entered his chest. What later puzzled many people was that Vincent did not die in the field. Instead, he walked nearly a kilometer back toward the village. The road was almost empty at that hour. A few people saw him pass, yet no one fully understood what had happened. At last he returned to the place where he was staying. It was the Ravoux Inn, a small 2-story house near the center of the village. For several weeks, Vincent had been renting a simple room upstairs. The room contained little more than a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a small table. Yet for him it was close enough to the fields that he could walk there each day. When Vincent stepped into the inn that afternoon, the owner immediately sensed that something was wrong. He was helped upstairs to his room. The village doctor was called. The bullet was still inside his chest. News spread quickly through Auvers-sur-Oise. Villagers began quietly speaking to one another about what had happened. The strange painter who wandered the fields with his paint box and canvases was now lying in his small room with a grave wound. No one knew exactly what had happened out in the Wheatfield. That night, a telegram was sent to Paris. The message was addressed to Vincent's younger brother. His name was Theo van Gogh. Theo arrived in Auvers the following morning. The two brothers had been deeply close for many years. Vincent painted while Theo worked in the art trade in Paris. It was Theo who helped Vincent survive through the most difficult years of his life. He sent money. He wrote long letters. He encouraged his brother to continue painting at a time when almost no one seemed interested in the work. The two brothers stayed together in the small room at the inn. Vincent spoke very little about what had happened in the field. The doctors could not remove the bullet. The wound was too deep. 2 days later, in the early hours of July 29, 1890, Vincent van Gogh died. He was 37 years old. At that time, Vincent's name was almost unknown in the world of art. Most of his paintings were still in his studio or in Theo's possession. Throughout his life, Vincent had sold almost nothing. To many of his contemporaries, he was simply an eccentric painter, a solitary man who was difficult to understand. Yet years later, those paintings would travel across the world. Golden wheat fields, swirling skies filled with stars, radiant sunflowers. They would become some of the most recognizable images in the history of art. But on that summer afternoon in Auvers-sur-Oise in 1890, all of that still lay in the future. Out in the fields, the wind continued to pass through the wheat, and somewhere within that wide sea of gold, the small path where Vincent had stood that afternoon remained silent beneath the summer sky. Time would pass along that path, one harvest after another. Yet the question of that afternoon on July 27th and the deeper story of Vincent van Gogh's life would remain. To understand it, we must travel many years back, to a small village in the Netherlands, the place where this story truly begins. Chapter 2. Born after a grave. Vincent van Gogh and the name of the dead. There is a small detail in the life of Vincent van Gogh that many people only discover later. Before he ever held a paintbrush, before his paintings appeared on the walls of museums, Before his name became one of the most familiar in the history of art, there was already a gravestone bearing that name. It stands in the small cemetery of Zundert, a quiet village in the southern Netherlands. The cemetery lies beside the village's Protestant church, surrounded by old trees and a low brick wall. On spring mornings, a thin mist often settles over the stone markers, and the whole place seems gently separated from the rest of the world. On one of those stones, a name is carved: Vincent van Gogh. Below the name are two dates, a birth and a death. The two are exactly 1 year apart. That child was born in 1852 and died within the same year. 1 year later, on March 30th, 1853, another child was born into the same family. This child was also named Vincent. The boy's father was Theodorus van Gogh, the minister of the Zundert church. He was a serious man, yet deeply devoted to his small parish. His work was simple and constant: Sunday services, visits to families in the village, sometimes quiet prayers beside the beds of those nearing the end of their lives. Vincent's mother was Anna Cornelia Carbentus, the daughter of a family with artistic traditions. She was thoughtful and careful in her nature. In her spare time, she liked to draw small pictures of flowers and landscapes or tend the garden behind the house. The Van Gogh family lived in the parsonage beside the church. It was a 2-story brick house, modest but solid, looking out across the flat fields that defined the Brabant countryside. Life in Zundert in the middle of the 19th century was quiet. Most people lived by farming. Dirt roads connected the farms with the church and the small village market. Beyond the village, the wider world was changing quickly. The Industrial Revolution was spreading across Europe. Cities like Amsterdam, Paris, and London were becoming larger, louder, and more modern. But in villages like Zundert, the rhythm of life remained much the same as it had been for generations. Church bells rang each Sunday morning. Farmers worked the fields. Children walked along narrow roads to the village school. Vincent grew up within that world. In the afternoons after school, he often wandered away from the village road and out toward the fields. Brabant was a land of wide horizons, where the sky seemed larger than in other places. Dirt paths ran between open fields, sometimes leading toward old willow trees standing quietly in the wind. He could walk for hours without feeling bored. Vincent watched the small changes in the landscape around him, the shifting colors of the fields through the seasons, the light resting on the roofs of farmhouses, the slow movement of clouds across the wide sky. Many years later, when he had begun painting, Vincent would say that nature was where he felt most at home. Perhaps that connection had already begun during those quiet afternoons in Brabant. Even as a child, he was rather quiet. Not the quietness of shyness, but something closer to silent observation. He often walked alone through the fields and the small woods near the village. He watched the rows of trees, the winding dirt roads, and the vast skies that stretched above the plains of Brabant. Some children are drawn to noisy games. Vincent seemed more inclined to watch than to join. The Van Gogh household was full of children. Vincent was the oldest among those who survived infancy. After him came his siblings, Anna, Theo, Elizabeth, Wilhelmina, and Cornelis. Among them, the brother who would one day become closest to him was Theo van Gogh, born in 1857. But when Vincent was still a boy, the place he saw most often was not the rooms of a crowded home. It was the cemetery behind the church. The cemetery stood beside a road Vincent passed almost every day. And there among the quiet rows of stone was a grave that carried his own name. Some historians later suggested that this may have left a deep impression on him. Imagine a child who year after year walks past a stone bearing his own name, a name that had once belonged to someone else. In the 19th century, it was not unusual for a family to give a newborn the name of a child who had died before. It was a way of remembering the lost one. Yet for a sensitive child, symbols like that could carry a weight of their own. Vincent was not a particularly remarkable student at the village school. He performed adequately, sometimes quite well in certain subjects, but he was never considered exceptional. What teachers remembered most clearly was his quiet seriousness, which set him apart from the other children. He spoke little, but he observed closely. He loved walking through the countryside, the fields, the willow trees, the dirt roads that circled the village. These ordinary landscapes would later appear again and again in his paintings. The Van Gogh family was deeply religious, and faith shaped the rhythm of daily life. Vincent's father hoped his children would grow into people of integrity and purpose. Stories from the Bible evening prayers and Sunday sermons formed a steady part of Vincent's childhood. At times, Vincent himself seemed to imagine that he might follow his father's path. Perhaps he would become a minister or a missionary. But youth rarely follows the road that has already been drawn. As Vincent grew older, his character became more complex. At times, he could be filled with enthusiasm, absorbed completely in something that captured his interest. At other times, he grew withdrawn and heavy-hearted. Those around him sometimes struggled to understand the shifts in his mood. The family continued to hope that Vincent would find a stable direction in life, a respectable profession, a place of dignity in society. At that time, no one in the village of Zundert could have imagined that the quiet boy would one day become a painter. Vincent himself had not yet thought of it. Painting had not yet entered his life as a calling. In Zundert, life continued to move slowly. Church bells rang each Sunday morning. The fields changed color with the seasons, and in the small cemetery beside the church, the stone bearing the name Vincent van Gogh remained where it had always stood silent beneath the trees. Many years later, when the world began to recognize the name Vincent van Gogh, that stone was still there, a name that had once belonged to a child, and later belonged to another man. A man whose life would pass through cities, fields, dreams, and storms of the mind before ending one summer afternoon in a wheat field at Auvers. But in the spring of 1853, all of that was still far away. The harvest seasons continued to pass in Brabant. Vincent grew up among those fields, and when he reached the age of 16, life began to lead him away from Zundert. Chapter 3. A Restless Young Man. The early years beyond Zundert. That morning, the dirt road leading out of the village of Zundert was still damp from the rain that had fallen during the night. The fields of Brabant stretched beneath the pale gray sky of northern Europe. In front of the parsonage, a 16-year-old boy prepared to leave home for the first time. Vincent van Gogh carried little with him. A small suitcase, a few sets of clothes, and the quiet expectations of his family behind him. In the Van Gogh family, it was not unusual for a young man to leave the village to find work. The 19th century was a time of rapid change in Europe. Agricultural villages like Zundert still moved at a slow rhythm. But in the great cities, trade and industry were opening new opportunities. With the help of an uncle, Vincent found a position at an international art dealership called Wheatfield and Sien. For the Van Gogh family, this was a valuable opportunity. Wheatfield and Sien was one of the largest art dealers in Europe at the time, with branches across Paris, London, Brussels, and The Hague. The company specialized in selling paintings, prints, and reproductions of famous artworks to the growing middle class and the wealthy elite. Vincent began his work at the branch in The Hague. For a young man who had grown up among the quiet fields of Brabant, the city felt entirely different. Busy streets, bright shop windows, galleries filled with paintings. Inside the company's offices, artworks were carefully wrapped, labeled, and prepared for shipment across Europe. Vincent's early tasks were simple. He helped sort paintings, prepare orders, and sometimes stood in the gallery observing customers. Yet the job offered him something more important than routine work. It allowed him to stand among paintings every single day. Each day, Vincent saw luminous landscapes of Italy, quiet scenes of the French countryside, and portraits rendered with delicate skill. For many employees in the gallery, these works were simply merchandise. Their value was measured in how much they could be sold for. Vincent saw them differently. Some paintings held him still for minutes at a time, not as someone calculating their price, but as if he were trying to understand something hidden beneath the layers of paint on the canvas. In those early years, Vincent performed well at his job. He worked diligently and seriously, and his supervisors considered him a reliable employee. His family in the Netherlands felt reassured. It seemed that Vincent had found a stable path. In 1873, the company decided to transfer him to the London branch. For a young employee, this was a significant step forward. London in the 1870s was one of the largest cities in the world. Smoke from factories drifted into the gray sky. Horse-drawn carriages rolled constantly over the stone streets. Crowds of people flowed across the bridges spanning the River Thames. Vincent rented a small room in a boarding house. From the window of that room, he could look down onto busy streets where the movement of people and carriages seemed almost endless. London filled Vincent with a sense of discovery. He enjoyed walking through wide city parks, pausing outside bookshops or art galleries. In letters sent home, Vincent described the city with enthusiasm. He began reading more and more. English literature, philosophy, and the Bible. Many evenings in his small rented room passed quietly among books and long moments of reflection. But over time, something began to shift in the way Vincent saw his work. Inside the gallery, he often watched customers as they entered. Men in long coats, wealthy women arriving with friends. They paused before the paintings, discussing the colors, the landscapes, and which picture might suit the walls of their drawing rooms. For many of them, art was simply a part of refined living. But Vincent increasingly felt distant from conversations like these. Standing in the gallery, he often found himself looking at the paintings longer than he watched the people who might buy them. Art in his eyes seemed to hold another meaning, something deeper than the decoration of a wall. At first the difference was subtle, but slowly it grew clearer. Vincent began to show impatience with the work of selling art. He disliked persuading a customer to buy a painting simply because it was fashionable. At times he lingered too long in front of a painting instead of attending to visitors in the showroom. For a commercial company like Wheatfield, this was not a good sign. In 1875, Vincent was transferred to Paris, then the great center of European art. Galleries and studios appeared across the city. Young painters were experimenting with new styles. The art market was becoming increasingly lively. Yet for Vincent, the change did not resolve the deeper problem. The longer he remained in the world of art dealing, the more alien it began to feel. Negotiations over prices, sales strategies, conversations about the tastes of wealthy clients. None of this seemed to be what Vincent was truly searching for. In the company's eyes, he gradually became a difficult employee. His performance declined. His manner with customers could sometimes be too blunt. Vincent seemed less and less concerned with keeping his position. Finally, in 1876, the company decided to dismiss him. For the Van Gogh family, the news came as a shock. The position at Wheatfield had once seemed like the beginning of a stable career. But now, at the age of 23, Vincent once again stood at a crossroads. He had seen the art world from behind the sales counter, and what he saw was not what he had expected. When Vincent left the art dealership, he carried with him more questions than answers. The road ahead remained uncertain. Yet a new thought had begun to take shape in his mind. An idea he had never truly considered as his path before. Not art, faith. Yet the turning point in Vincent's London years did not arrive in a gallery or behind the polished counters of an art dealership. It came somewhere much quieter, in a modest boarding house, and in a conversation that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Chapter 4. London. Love and faith, a broken heart, and the road toward religion. Sometimes the course of a life does not change because of a great event, but because of something very small. A short conversation, a simple answer, a door quietly closing. For Vincent van Gogh, that moment seems to have come during his London years in the early 1870s. The city at that time stood at the center of a vast empire. Crowded streets stretched through neighborhoods of brick houses. Long bridges crossed the River Thames. In the mornings, horse-drawn carriages rolled across the stone roads. In the evenings, pale gaslight glowed over wet sidewalks after the rain. Vincent lived in a small room in a boarding house run by a French family. Life there was simple: a narrow bed, a small table, a few books resting beside the window. At the time, Vincent was still working for the art dealers, Wheatfield and Sien. In the evenings, he often walked through the streets or read quietly in his room. In that house lived a young woman named Eugenie Loyer. At first, she was simply part of the daily rhythm of the house. Someone passing along the stairs, a voice heard in the dining room, a polite smile when they happened to meet in the morning. But as time passed, Vincent began to notice her more often. In the evenings, returning from work, he heard her footsteps on the wooden stairs. Sometimes they spoke for a few minutes in the dining room of the house. In a large, unfamiliar city, small familiar details like these slowly began to matter. Vincent was not someone who easily revealed his emotions. Yet this time the feeling quietly grew within him. Eventually, he decided to tell Eugenie how he felt. The answer he received was brief. She was already engaged to someone else. There was no argument, no dramatic farewell. But for Vincent, the moment felt like a door quietly closing before him. Afterward, people around him began to notice a change. Vincent grew more withdrawn. He joined fewer conversations at the dining table of the boarding house. At work, he no longer showed the same enthusiasm. Customers who entered the gallery sometimes found themselves greeted by an employee who seemed only mildly interested in selling paintings. But the change did not come only from the disappointment of love. It seemed to reflect something deeper. During his years in London, Vincent had begun reading the Bible more and more often. He carried it with him when walking through parks or sat reading it in his room during the evenings. The stories of compassion, sacrifice, and the lives of the poor seemed to touch him deeply. Vincent began to wonder if his life should not be tied to commerce. Perhaps it should be tied to something else. In 1876, after leaving Goupil, Vincent returned to England for a time. He worked as an assistant teacher at a small school in Ramsgate and later moved to another school in Isleworth. The work was modest and the pay was small, but Vincent did not seem overly concerned. What began to draw his attention more strongly was religion. He started explaining passages from the Bible to the students. In the evenings, he attended prayer meetings and read sermons written by theologians. The idea of becoming a minister like his father slowly grew stronger in his mind. Vincent returned to the Netherlands with the hope of studying theology. But that path was not easy. The entrance examinations for theological study were demanding, and Vincent was not an exceptional student in the classical subjects that were required. After a period of effort, he was unable to meet the academic standards needed to continue. Once again, the road ahead became uncertain. In time, Vincent found another way to pursue the religious calling he felt within himself. Not as an ordained minister, but as a missionary among the poor. In 1879, he traveled to an industrial region in Belgium known as the Borinage. It was a harsh landscape. Coal mines sank deep beneath the earth. Small brick houses crowded together around the pits. The miners worked long hours each day in darkness, returning home with their faces covered in black coal dust. Vincent was deeply moved by the life he saw there. He began living in extreme simplicity, almost like an ascetic. He gave away many of his possessions, shared food with poor families, and spent much of his time visiting miners who were sick or injured. To Vincent, this was what religion truly meant: living among the poor and sharing in their lives. But this way of living troubled the leaders of the church. They believed Vincent had gone too far. In their view, a missionary did not need to live with such severity. After some time, his missionary appointment in the Borinage was not renewed. Once again, Vincent lost the path he had tried to follow. By the age of 26, he had failed in commerce. Now he had also failed in the religious vocation he had hoped to pursue. Yet it was in the Borinage, inside the small homes of the miners, that a new idea slowly began to form in Vincent's mind. In the evenings, he often sat with the workers, looking at their tired faces after long days underground. Those faces carried the hard lines of labor and poverty. Vincent began to draw them. At first, they were only simple pencil sketches, rough lines on paper, attempts to capture the light of an oil lamp resting on the faces of the miners. Perhaps Vincent did not fully realize it at the time. But within those quiet drawings, a new road was beginning to open before him. Chapter 5. The Decision at 27. The moment Vincent chose to become a painter. There are moments in a person's life when a decision is made not out of certainty, but out of desperation. In the summer of 1880, inside a small room in the poor mining region of Belgium, Vincent van Gogh sat at a rough wooden table. In front of him lay a few sheets of paper and a worn pencil. Outside the window, the sky above the Borinage hung heavy and gray. Smoke from the coal mines drifted upward, dissolving into the low clouds above rows of dark brick houses. The missionary work he had once believed in had already come to an end. Once again, Vincent lost the path he had tried so hard to follow. At 27, he had failed in commerce. He had also failed in the religious life he had hoped to pursue. For many people, this might have been the moment to abandon larger dreams and search for a more stable profession. But for Vincent, the months in the Borinage left a different kind of mark. He had lived among some of the poorest laborers of industrial Europe. He had seen their lives inside narrow houses, their simple meals, their tired faces after long days beneath the earth. Those faces remained in his memory. The sketches he had made during those months stayed with him. He began to draw them. At first, they were only simple pencil sketches. The lines were uncertain, the proportions sometimes imperfect, yet Vincent worked with intense concentration. Under the dim light of an oil lamp, he tried to capture the thin faces and rough hands of men who had spent their lives underground. There was something in these drawings that made him feel closer to his purpose than anything he had done before. Vincent began to think that perhaps he could speak about the lives of working people in another way. Not through sermons, through images. In the months that followed, he began reading books about art. He studied prints and drawings made by artists he admired. Among those who influenced him most deeply was Jean-François Millet. Millet painted farmers sowing seeds, harvesting wheat, or bending quietly over their fields. There was no glamour in these scenes. Only labor, soil, and the soft light of late afternoon resting over the land. Vincent felt that these paintings spoke about human life in the way he had always been searching for. Not long afterward, Vincent wrote an important letter to his younger brother, Theo van Gogh. For many years, Theo had been the person closest to him. The two brothers often exchanged letters sharing their thoughts on life, religion, and art. In that letter, Vincent spoke about his drawings. He wrote about the miners, about the faces he could not forget. And for the first time he set down in words an idea that had until then lived only in his thoughts. Vincent wanted to become a painter. He wrote that he believed he could learn, that if he worked hard enough, he might find a way to draw the people he had lived among in the Borinage. That letter marked a turning point. From that moment, Vincent van Gogh's life began to take a completely different direction. It was not an easy decision. Vincent was already 27 years old. He had almost no formal training in art. He had little money. Those around him may have thought the idea unrealistic. But Theo responded differently. Instead of discouraging his brother, he chose to support him. Theo worked in the art trade in Paris and understood the world of painting far better than Vincent. He began sending money so that Vincent could buy paper pencils and later paint. From that point on, a remarkable relationship between the two brothers slowly took shape. Vincent painted. Theo helped him survive. Over the years that followed, the two exchanged hundreds of letters. Those letters would later become one of the most valuable sources for understanding Vincent van Gogh's life. But in the year 1880, all of that still lay ahead. Vincent was only just beginning. He practiced drawing almost every day. He studied how to draw hands, faces, and the human body. He copied prints, sketched the workers around him, and tried to understand the structure of the human form. His early drawings were still rough. Yet within them, something had already appeared that would later become the mark of Vincent van Gogh. A deep attention to ordinary people. Farmers, laborers, faces shaped by a difficult life. For Vincent, art was not something meant only for the wealthy or for the walls of elegant houses. It was a way of seeing the dignity of human life in the most humble places. These ideas would lead him into the next chapter of his life, a period in which Vincent devoted nearly all his time to drawing and painting the farmers and laborers around him. And inside the small houses of the Dutch countryside, he would begin to create the first paintings that truly carried his own voice. Chapter 6. Painting the Peasants. Years among workers and the relationship with Sien. In the early 1880s, when Vincent van Gogh decided to become a painter, the road ahead of him was almost entirely uncertain. He had little money, no formal training, and no place within the established world of art. The only thing he possessed was a determination that bordered on the extreme. Vincent began drawing almost every day. He drew hands, feet, and the faces of working people. He copied prints and studied the structure of the human body. His early drawings were awkward, sometimes uneven in proportion. Yet Vincent worked with a rare intensity. In letters to his younger brother Theo van Gogh, he often said that painting felt to him like a craft. It required time, patience, and many failures. During those early years, Vincent moved between several small towns in the Netherlands and Belgium. He lived in modest places, renting simple rooms, and spending most of his time drawing. The subjects that interested him most were not beautiful landscapes or historical figures. Instead, he was drawn to ordinary laborers, farmers' workers, people who lived by the strength of their hands. To Vincent, their lives carried a quiet kind of beauty. In one letter, he wrote that the rough hands of a farmer held a truth that art should capture. The same was true for faces shaped by wind and sunlight, lined by years of work. Vincent wanted to paint people as truthfully as possible. In 1881, he returned to live with his family in the town of Etten for a time. His relationship with his parents was not always easy. His father, the minister Theodorus van Gogh, hoped his son might still choose a more stable path. But by now, Vincent had almost no intention of returning to any other profession. After some time in Etten, he moved to The Hague. There, Vincent began receiving guidance from a distant relative, the painter Anton Mauve. Mauve helped him better understand drawing techniques and encouraged him to continue practicing. While living in The Hague, Vincent's life took another unexpected turn when he met a woman named Clasina Maria Hornig. Friends called her Sien. Sien was a poor woman living under very difficult circumstances. When Vincent met her, she was pregnant and caring for a young child. Her life was marked by poverty and at times by prostitution. Vincent decided to bring her to live with him. To many people around him, the decision was shocking. Vincent's family, especially his father, strongly opposed the relationship. They feared it would destroy whatever future he still had. But Vincent saw the situation differently. He believed he could help Sien build a better life. He wanted to protect her from the streets. Inside the small room where they lived together, Vincent continued to draw. Sien and her child often became the models for his sketches. These drawings were not formal portraits. They were quiet scenes from everyday life. A woman sitting beside a window. A mother holding her child. A body worn out after a long day. One of the most well-known drawings from this period is titled Sorrow. It shows a woman seated, her body bent forward in quiet despair. It was an image far removed from the elegant paintings that filled many European galleries at the time. While many artists painted beautiful scenery or portraits of aristocrats, Vincent spent his time drawing the poor. But life with Sien was not easy. Vincent had almost no stable income. Most of their living expenses came from the financial support Theo continued to send. Poverty pressure from his family, and the daily weight of hardship gradually strained the relationship between Vincent and Sien. In 1883, Vincent decided to leave The Hague and move to the rural region of Drenthe. Around this time, his relationship with Sien also ended. It was not a peaceful separation. Yet for Vincent, the years he spent living with Sien left a deep mark on the way he saw people in their lives. Vincent did not remain in Drenthe long. Only a few months later, he returned once again to live near his family, this time in the village of Nuenen. Small villages, potato fields, and the homes of farmers became his new world. Here, Vincent continued to paint working people. He spent long hours in farmers' houses, watching them work, eat, and rest after long days in the fields. He wanted to understand how they lived, how they moved, how how the light of an oil lamp fell across their faces in the evening. During these years, Vincent's palette was very dark. He used many browns, deep greens, and grays. The paintings carried a heavy feeling, almost like the difficult lives of the people he portrayed. Vincent believed that art must be honest. If the life of a farmer was harsh and demanding, then the painting should carry that same truth. These ideas gradually led Vincent toward a painting he would later consider the most important work of his early years. It depicted a very simple meal. A meal shared by farmers after a long day working in the fields. The painting would be called The Potato Eaters. Chapter 7. The Potato Eaters, the painting that revealed his first artistic philosophy. When the sun sank behind the quiet potato fields, darkness quickly spread across the dirt roads and the low roofs of the farmers' houses. In the evenings, in the small village of Nuenen, the light inside those homes was usually dim. A small oil lamp hung from the ceiling, casting a soft circle of light over the rough wooden table where the family gathered to eat after a long day in the fields. They ate quietly. A bowl of boiled potatoes passed slowly from hand to hand. A small coffee pot sat in the center of the table. Outside the window, the wind moved across the fields, carrying with it the damp scent of evening soil. For many people, it would have been only an ordinary meal. But for Vincent van Gogh, it was a scene he wanted to paint. During the years he lived in Nuenen, Vincent spent much of his time among the farmers. He walked through the potato fields, sat in their dark, modest homes, and watched the rhythms of their work and daily life. He wanted to understand their world not only with his eyes, but through time. Vincent once wrote that to paint farmers honestly, an artist had to live close enough to them to feel the rhythm of their lives. During this period in Nuenen, he also spent many hours drawing the village weavers. The rooms where they worked were usually narrow and dim. Large wooden looms filled most of the space, clattering softly with each movement. The weaver sat before the loom almost as if he were part of the great wooden machine itself. Vincent was fascinated by this image. To him, it seemed like a symbol of quiet labor. People who spent their entire lives repeating the same movements day after day in silence. Throughout 1884 and the early months of 1885, Vincent began preparing for a painting that he believed would become the most important work he had created so far. He did not begin it immediately. First, he drew hundreds of studies. He sketched the rough hands of workers. He drew thin faces illuminated by the weak light of an oil lamp. He drew farmers resting after long hours of labor. Sometimes the drawings focused on only a head, a pair of hands, or the posture of someone seated at a table. Vincent knew he still lacked experience, so he practiced almost every day. He studied how the dim light of an oil lamp fell across a human face. He experimented with different arrangements for the dinner table. He wanted the final painting to feel natural, like a quiet moment of daily life glimpsed through the doorway of a farmer's house. The people who appeared in the painting were not professional models. They were a farming family that Vincent knew in the village. In the evenings, he visited their home, sitting quietly in a corner of the room while they ate their supper. The old wooden chairs creaked softly as they shifted. Bowls touched the table with a dry sound. Outside the window, the wind moved through the dark potato fields. Vincent watched every detail. He wanted the painting not only to resemble their life, but to carry the feeling of it as well. Vincent's goal was not to create beauty in the usual sense. He wanted to paint the truth. In letters to his brother Theo van Gogh, Vincent explained that he wanted the people in the painting to look like men and women who had truly dug the earth with their own hands. He wanted the viewer to feel that those hands had worked in the potato fields. So Vincent deliberately painted rough, weathered faces and dark complexions. The light in the painting is not bright or clean. It carries a muted green and brown tone, much like the real light in a small farmhouse. The painting was completed in the spring of 1885. Its title was The Potato Eaters. In the painting, 5 farmers sit around a small table. They are eating potatoes and drinking coffee after a long day of labor. The only light comes from a lamp hanging from the ceiling, illuminating their faces and their hands. Those faces are not beautiful by the standards of academic art. They are thin, angular, and tired. But to Vincent, that was precisely the point. He believed these people deserved to be painted with the same respect as any figure in a grand historical painting. In one letter, Vincent wrote that the farmers in his picture had eaten potatoes with the very hands that dug them from the earth. This was his first clear artistic philosophy. Art should speak about real life. But when Vincent showed the painting to Theo and several friends, the response was not what he had hoped for. Many thought the painting too dark. The faces seemed rough and unrefined. Some even believed Vincent did not yet possess the skill to create a work of such ambition. Vincent sent prints of the painting to a few artists he knew, hoping they might understand what he had tried to do. The responses were distant. Some felt the painting was too heavy, lacking the elegance that contemporary art was expected to show. The criticism disappointed Vincent. He believed he had done something honest. Yet the art world did not seem ready to see it the way he did. Still, Vincent considered the potato eaters an important step forward. For the first time, he felt he had created a painting that truly expressed what he wanted to say. Yet just at that moment, another major change arrived in his life. His father died. The death of his father, the minister Theodorus van Gogh, led Vincent to decide that it was time to leave Nieuwenen. The farming villages of the Netherlands had taught him how to see the world. But to grow further as a painter, Vincent felt he needed to encounter a larger artistic world, a place where new ideas about painting were beginning to appear, a place where color itself was starting to change. That place was Paris. Chapter 8. Paris and the Explosion of Color. When Vincent discovered modern art. In the spring of 1886, as the train from the north slowly approached the French capital, the sky above Paris was veiled in a thin silver-gray mist. Rows of steep rooftops stretched toward the horizon. Smoke rose softly from chimneys, dissolving into the pale morning air. For Vincent van Gogh, the city felt like a completely different world from the farming villages he had just left behind. Paris at the end of the 19th century was living through an explosion of artistic energy. Cafes in Montmartre were filled with young painters debating color and light. Small galleries displayed new works one after another. Art was changing quickly, and Vincent, carrying a small suitcase and a few rolled canvases, had just stepped into the center of that storm. He came to Paris to live with his younger brother, Theo van Gogh. By this time, Theo worked for a large gallery on Boulevard Montmartre. His job involved selling paintings by contemporary artists, many of whose names were still subjects of debate within the art world. The brothers lived in a small apartment high in a Montmartre building. The rooms were modest, but for Vincent the place opened an entirely new door. During his first days in Paris, Vincent spent long hours visiting galleries and exhibitions. There he encountered paintings unlike anything he had created in the Netherlands. The colors were brighter, the light more vivid, the brushstrokes freer. One of the greatest influences on Vincent during this time came from a group of painters later known as the Impressionists. In galleries and cafes, Vincent began meeting artists who were experimenting with an entirely new way of painting. They painted light instead of precise detail. They painted fleeting moments in nature. One of the painters who impressed Vincent most deeply was Claude Monet. Monet's paintings of rivers, gardens, and shifting daylight astonished him. Vincent began to realize that painting did not have to be dark and heavy, as his own work had been in Nouenen. Vincent also met many other young painters during evenings in Montmartre. Among them was Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, who would later become famous for his paintings of Parisian nightlife. Conversations among these artists often stretched late into the night in smoke-filled cafes. They argued about color, about light, and about the future of painting. Another artist who left a strong impression on Vincent was Paul Gauguin. Gauguin possessed a forceful personality and spoke about art with a confidence that sometimes felt almost confrontational. He believed painting should not simply copy nature, but create its own world of color and form. These conversations with Gauguin gave Vincent much to think about. Yet the greatest influence on Vincent's painting during his time in Paris may not have come from any single individual. It came from color. During his first months in Paris, Vincent's palette began to change dramatically. The dark browns and deep greens of his Dutch period slowly disappeared. In their place appeared bright yellows, blues, and reds. He also began experimenting with shorter, quicker brushstrokes. Vincent soon found himself captivated by another source of inspiration that had traveled from far beyond Europe. It was Japanese art. In shops around Paris, Vincent discovered Japanese woodblock prints being sold for modest prices. These images came from an artistic tradition known as ukiyo-e. One of the most celebrated artists of this tradition was Utagawa Hiroshige. Hiroshige's prints looked strikingly different from European paintings. They used flat areas of color, strong outlines, and daring perspectives. Vincent was immediately fascinated. He began collecting these prints and hanging them on the walls of his room. Vincent even copied several Japanese prints in oil. Through this process, he learned to use stronger colors and simpler compositions. To him, Japanese art seemed to carry a sense of freedom he had never encountered before. During his time in Paris, Vincent also painted many portraits. Not formal portraits, but portraits of friends, fellow artists, and sometimes himself. He began painting numerous self-portraits, partly because he did not have the money to hire models, but also because he wanted to understand how color and light could transform the human face. In many of these self-portraits from the Paris period, Vincent experimented with bold color combinations. Blue backgrounds, green coats, yellow brushstrokes vibrating around the contours of the face. These were important experiments. Yet even though Paris gave Vincent enormous inspiration, life there was not always easy. The small apartment he shared with Theo was often crowded with canvases, easels, and the sharp smell of oil paint. Vincent worked with relentless intensity, sometimes pushing himself to the brink of exhaustion. He painted almost every day. Watching the changes in Vincent's work, Theo began to realize that his brother was entering an entirely new phase. But after nearly 2 years in Paris, Vincent began to tire of the city's pace. Paris was full of artists, but it was also full of competition. Vincent started thinking about another place, somewhere with stronger light, more vivid color, and wider landscapes. He thought about the south of France, a land where sunlight poured across golden fields through the long summer, a place where Vincent believed he might build a new community of artists. That place was Arles. Chapter 9. The Yellow House Dream. Arles sunflowers and the dream of an artist's community. There are places where light seems to carry a power of its own. On a February morning in 1888, when the train stopped at the small station of the town of Arles, Vincent van Gogh stepped onto the platform with his worn suitcase and a few rolled canvases. The air here felt completely different from Paris. The light of southern France was sharper, clearer. The sky stretched buoyant and deep blue. Fields spread beneath the sun like vast sheets of glowing gold. Vincent stood on the platform for a long moment, looking around this small town. After nearly 2 years in the restless noise of Paris, the place offered him a different feeling. Fewer people, less sound. Yet the light seemed almost twice as powerful. Vincent believed he had found the right place to paint. Arles was an old town in Provence. Narrow streets, low houses painted in pale yellow. Wide fields surrounding the city. In spring, winds from the Camargue swept across wheat fields and olive groves. For Vincent, it felt like an entirely new world. He began painting almost immediately. Only days after arriving in Arles, Vincent carried his easel outside the town and began painting the fields and roads around it. The light here changed quickly. Morning carried a cool blue tone. At noon, the world burned with yellow. By evening, the colors softened into orange and violet. Vincent tried to keep pace with these changes. His brushstrokes became faster and more forceful. During his first months in Arles, Vincent painted many landscapes. Roads winding through open fields, peach trees blossoming in spring, orchards glowing beneath the southern sun. These paintings carried colors more vivid than anything he had created before. But Vincent did not want to paint landscapes alone. He held a larger dream. He wanted to create a community of artists in the south of France. In letters to his brother Theo van Gogh, Vincent often wrote about this idea. He imagined painters coming to Arles to live and work together. A place where artists could share ideas, argue about art, and build a new style together. Vincent called it the Studio of the South. To prepare for this dream, Vincent rented a small house in Arles. The house stood near the square known as Place Lamartine. It had 2 floors and walls painted in a bright yellow. Vincent loved the color. He called it the Yellow House. The building was not large, but Vincent imagined several artists living there together. He began decorating the rooms with his own paintings. In the small bedroom upstairs, Vincent placed his simple wooden bed. Pale walls, a wooden chair beside the bed, and a small table beneath the window created a space of quiet simplicity. Years later, that room would become the subject of one of his most famous paintings. But before the dream of an artist's community could truly begin, Vincent wanted to prepare something special for the friend he hoped would come to Arles. That friend was Paul Gauguin. Vincent believed Gauguin was someone who could truly understand his artistic ideas. He hoped Gauguin would leave Paris and come to Arles to live and work beside him. But for that to happen, Vincent needed his brother's help. Theo van Gogh understood that Gauguin was struggling financially. So he proposed an arrangement. He would provide Paul Gauguin with a monthly allowance if Gauguin agreed to travel to Arles and work with Vincent. For Gauguin, the offer was convincing enough to leave Paris. To prepare the room that would belong to Gauguin in the Yellow House, Vincent began painting a new series of works. The subject was very simple: sunflowers. Placed in a ceramic vase on a table, the sunflowers opened their wide petals beneath the strong southern light. Vincent painted them with thick, rapid brushstrokes. Yellow filled the canvas, the yellow of the petals, the yellow of the light, the yellow of the wall behind them. This series would later be known as Sunflowers. But these paintings were not meant only as decoration. For Vincent, they were symbols of friendship. He planned to hang them in Gauguin's room as a gesture of welcome. During his months in Arles, Vincent worked with an intensity that seemed almost impossible. Some weeks he finished several paintings in succession. He painted in the morning, in the afternoon, and sometimes into the evening. Wheatfields stretching beneath wide skies, roads running through the countryside, dark cypress trees standing still in the wind. The southern light seemed to transform Vincent's painting completely. His palette grew brighter, his brush strokes thicker and more full of movement. In letters to Theo, Vincent wrote that the light in Arles made him feel as though he were living inside a Japanese painting. Yet life in Arles was not always easy. Vincent lived in considerable solitude. The people of the town sometimes watched him with curiosity. A foreign painter wandering through the fields with an easel and boxes of paint. He worked almost without rest, and the more he worked, the more important his dream of an artist's community became. Finally, in the autumn of 1888, Vincent received the news he had been waiting for. Gauguin had agreed to come to Arles. Vincent was filled with excitement. He cleaned the yellow house, prepared Gauguin's room, and hung the sunflower paintings on the walls. For Vincent, this was not simply the arrival of a friend. It was the beginning of a dream. A community of artists in the south of France. A place where art could grow in an entirely new direction. But that dream, like many dreams in the life of Vincent van Gogh, would not unfold the way he imagined. When Gauguin arrived in Arles, the two painters began living and working together in the Yellow House. And in the weeks that followed, the relationship between them would grow more tense than anyone could have predicted. Chapter 10. Van Gogh and Gauguin. Friendship, conflict, and the night of the severed ear. When Paul Gauguin stepped off the train in Arles at the end of October 1888, the dream Vincent van Gogh had carried for months finally seemed to become real. The Yellow House at Place Lamartine was no longer only the shelter of a solitary painter. In Vincent's imagination, it was about to become the center of something larger. After the long letters sent to Theo van Gogh, after the weeks of waiting beneath the blazing southern sun, after the sunflower paintings prepared as a gesture of welcome, the friend Vincent believed could help him build the studio of the South had finally arrived. During the day, the two painters walked out with their easels, following dirt roads beyond Arles. Passing harvested fields, low trees, and the wide sky of autumn. In the evening, they returned to the small house, ate simple meals, drank wine, and continued talking late into the night. From the outside, it might have looked like an ideal scene. Two artists living beneath the light of southern France, sharing a belief in painting. Yet from the very beginning, beneath that excitement, there was a quiet difference in rhythm between them. Gauguin and Vincent were almost opposites in both temperament and artistic vision. Gauguin was calmer, more reserved, and carried himself with a certain pride. He liked to control situations, argue his ideas clearly, and keep a certain distance from the world. Vincent was the opposite. Intense, direct, easily moved by emotion, he seemed to live almost entirely within the shifting currents of his feelings. If Gauguin entered a room like someone who already knew who he was, Vincent entered like someone still searching for the answer. These differences appeared most clearly in the way they painted. Vincent preferred to work directly in front of nature. He needed the wind, the light, the presence of the landscape before his eyes. His brush strokes were fast and thick, carrying the urgency of his inner life. Gauguin believed something different. For him, the painter did not have to obey what stood before the eyes. Painting should pass through memory, through imagination, through the mind's power to choose and transform. Standing before the same landscape, Vincent wanted to capture the heartbeat of the moment. Gauguin wanted to turn it into an idea. At first, these differences were part of what drew them together. Vincent admired Gauguin's confidence and intellectual clarity. He believed his friend could give the project in Arles a solid foundation that he himself lacked. Gauguin, though sometimes irritated by Vincent's impulsive nature, recognized in him a rare energy. The two argued constantly about color, line, memory, religion, Japanese art, Delacroix, Rembrandt, and the future of painting. Some conversations were filled with excitement. Others felt almost like intellectual duels. Inside the narrow rooms of the Yellow House, art was not simply work. It was the air they breathed. It filled every meal, every evening, every silence. But living together is not the same as writing letters to one another, and debates in imagination are very different from facing a real person day after day. The Yellow House was far smaller than Vincent's dream had been. The rooms were cramped. Paintings covered the walls. The air carried the smell of oil paint, tobacco, and simple meals. Tools and canvases lay scattered about. Long hours of work and quiet fatigue slowly gathered in the house until the atmosphere itself seemed heavy. Vincent worked with an intensity that was almost merciless toward himself. He painted constantly, spoke constantly, thought constantly. Some days he seemed to live inside a fever of color and ideas. For Gauguin, it was both impressive and troubling. Beyond their differences in temperament and artistic method, there was another quiet but important truth. Gauguin's presence in Arles did not rest on friendship alone. It was made possible in part by Théo's financial support. This created a strange balance between them. Vincent needed Gauguin so that his dream of an artist's community would not collapse. Gauguin needed the money to continue living and painting. And Theo stood between them like a bridge that both supported the connection and made it more fragile. A friendship tied to expectation and money is rarely entirely free. During this time, Vincent continued working at an astonishing pace. He painted Gauguin's portrait. He painted his own room in the bedroom. He painted chairs, the night cafe, the gardens, and the roads of Arles. It was as though he were trying to hold everything around him still with oil paint, as if sensing that the world was slipping away too quickly. At times, he believed Gauguin's presence had sharpened his own art. Yet during that same period, signs of instability in his mental health began to grow more visible. Exhaustion, loneliness, absinthe, tobacco, relentless work, and the pressure of turning his dream into reality seemed to be pushing him towards some unseen limit. Gauguin soon realized that life in Arles was not something he wished to continue for long. The small town, the lack of friends, the uneasy atmosphere of the house, and above all, the growing tension with Vincent made him begin to think about leaving. Vincent sensed it almost immediately. For him, the thought of Gauguin leaving Arles was not only a personal sadness. It meant the Yellow House had failed. The studio of the South had failed. All the hopes he had placed in the Southern light in friendship between artists might dissolve into something unfinished, much like so many other things in his life. In the final days of December 1888, the air inside the Yellow House grew heavy. The two men still worked. They still ate together. But the tension could almost be felt in the silence between their words. Their arguments were no longer only about painting. They began to touch on pride control and the ways each man saw the other. The more Vincent feared being abandoned, the more fiercely he clung to the friendship, with an intensity that began to suffocate Gauguin. And the more Gauguin tried to keep his distance, the more Vincent's anxiety grew. On the evening of December 23rd, 1888, that tension finally broke. We will never know exactly what was said in the house that night. Most of the later accounts came from Gauguin, and over time the story itself has been reshaped again and again by legend. But it seems clear that a fierce argument took place. Gauguin left the house and walked out into the cold night. According to his account, Vincent followed him holding a razor. On a dark street in Arles, there was a moment when the two men faced one another. Then Vincent turned away. Gauguin continued walking and did not return to the yellow house that night. Vincent went back alone. What happened inside the small room afterward was never witnessed directly. But in the middle of a violent crisis, Vincent took the razor and cut off part of his left ear. There was a great deal of blood. The silence of the house was broken by the shock of what had happened. Then, in an act that was both strange and haunting, Vincent wrapped the severed piece of his ear and carried it to a brothel in the town where he handed it to a woman there. The precise details of that moment are still debated, yet the event itself has become one of the most tragic images in the history of art. The following morning, Vincent was found weak and bleeding heavily. He was taken to the hospital in Arles. News spread quickly through the small town. The townspeople who had already watched him with cautious curiosity now felt something closer to fear. The red-haired painter in the yellow house, the man who wandered the fields each day with his easel, was no longer simply eccentric. He had become a figure associated with danger and instability. Gauguin left Arles almost immediately afterward. The two men would continue to exchange letters, but they would never live together again. The yellow house still stood, but the dream Vincent had once hung upon its yellow walls had collapsed. The sunflowers he painted as symbols of friendship now seemed more like witnesses to a hope that had failed. Yet the night of the severed ear was not the end of Vincent's painting. In a strange and painful way, it opened another chapter of his life. After Arles, after the hospital, after the fear of the townspeople, Vincent would enter a place quieter and, in its own way, far more unsettling. A place of white walls, narrow windows, silent corridors, and the night sky seen through iron bars. Saint-Rémy was waiting for him. Chapter 11. Saint-Rémy and the Starry Night. When Vincent painted the sky from an asylum. Before the sun rises, the stone corridors of the old monastery at Saint-Rémy de Provence often sink into a silence that feels almost complete. The thick walls hold the chill of the night, and the first light of dawn takes time to slip through the narrow windows. Outside, the monastery garden still rests beneath a thin layer of morning mist. Olive trees stand quietly beneath a pale sky, while the low hills of Provence appear faint in the distance. Vincent van Gogh often woke very early during his days in Saint-Rémy. On many mornings, while the sky was still dark, he would walk to the window and look out across the wide space above the hills. The stars still hung in the sky, while the first light of the new day slowly formed along the far horizon. For Vincent, These moments held a particular fascination. The sky before dawn did not seem still. It appeared to move, like a dark ocean where small points of light drifted slowly past one another. After the events that took place in Arles at the end of 1888, Vincent's life had become more fragile than ever. The incident of the severed ear had frightened the townspeople. Rumors spread quickly through the town, and some residents even signed a petition calling for his removal from the community. In the months that followed, Vincent sometimes returned to work, but at other times he fell into severe mental crises that left him nearly exhausted. Finally, in May of 1889, Vincent voluntarily entered a mental health institution near the town of Saint-Rémy. The place had once been an old monastery with thick stone walls and long corridors. The atmosphere was both quiet and isolating. For many patients, it felt like a place of confinement. But for Vincent, it also offered something he had lacked for many months: stability. Vincent was given a small room for sleeping and another for painting. Although he was living inside the hospital, he was still allowed to work. And Vincent worked constantly. Painting remained the only thing that helped him maintain balance, when his mind began slipping into darker places. Life at Saint-Rémy slowly formed a repeating rhythm. In the mornings, Vincent often walked through the monastery garden. The olive trees with their twisting trunks, the purple irises growing close to the ground, and the wheat fields beyond the walls became familiar images in his paintings. The stone walls of the monastery, the narrow paths through the garden, and the low mountains of Provence appeared again and again on his canvases. Yet life there was not entirely peaceful. Vincent continued to suffer from severe psychological crises. There were weeks when he could not paint at all. The episodes came suddenly, leaving him disoriented and drained. But when the storms passed, Vincent returned to his easel again, as if painting were the single thread that could pull him back into the world. During his time in Saint-Rémy, Vincent painted many scenes of the landscape surrounding the monastery. Wheat fields bending in the wind, olive trees twisting beneath deep blue skies, clusters of iris flowers blooming in the hospital garden. One of the most striking paintings from this period is Irises. In the canvas, violet flowers rise densely among long green leaves, and the force of the brushstrokes makes the entire garden seem alive with movement. But there was another painting created one early morning that would later become one of the most recognizable images in the history of art. The painting is called The Starry Night. Vincent painted it in June of 1889. From the window of his room, he could see the hills in the distance. Yet in the painting, the landscape is not exactly what his eyes saw. The sky twists into wide, spiraling currents. The stars shine like glowing orbs of fire. A dark cypress tree rises from the ground, reaching upward as if trying to touch the sky itself. The village below rests quietly in shadow, but the sky above seems alive. Swirling currents of blue, yellow, and white make the heavens move like a vast river of light. In a letter to his brother Theo van Gogh, Vincent once wrote that he wanted to paint the night sky the way he felt it. not simply as small points of light in darkness, but as a vast and living space. Throughout the months in Saint-Rémy, Vincent continued to paint with astonishing intensity. He painted wheat fields under blazing sunlight, olive trees bending in the wind, and roads stretching through the countryside of Provence. Although he was confined within the monastery walls, the world inside Vincent's paintings seemed to grow wider and wider. Yet beyond the walls of the Asylum, the art world still knew almost nothing about these works. Vincent remained unknown. Most of his paintings still rested in his studio or in his brother's care. Theo, however, never lost faith in Vincent's talent. He continued sending money writing letters and encouraging his brother to keep painting. The letters between them became an essential lifeline. They helped Vincent feel that somewhere beyond the hospital walls there was someone who truly understood him. By the end of 1889, Vincent's health had begun to stabilize. But he began to think about leaving Saint-Rémy. The monastery had given him quiet and space to work, yet it was also a place of isolation. Vincent wanted to return to life outside. He hoped to find another place to continue painting, somewhere closer to Paris where Theo could visit from time to time, a small village along the banks of the river Arles. The village was called Auvers-sur-Oise. Chapter 12. Auvers and Dr. Gachet, Vincent's final hope. In the late spring of 1890, the countryside north of Paris was entering the first days of summer. The wheat fields had begun to turn a deep green, and a gentle wind moved across them, so that the whole landscape trembled like water. Narrow dirt roads curved through gardens and low stone houses. A little farther away, the river Oise flowed quietly, reflecting the wide sky above. One afternoon in May, a red-haired man stepped down from the small station platform of the village of Auvers-sur-Oise. He carried a worn suitcase and a few rolled canvases. After nearly a year in a mental hospital in the south of France, Vincent van Gogh had come here with the hope of beginning a new chapter in his life. The decision to come to Auvers was not accidental. His younger brother Theo van Gogh, along with several friends in Paris, believed Vincent needed a quiet place that was still close enough to the capital. They also knew someone who might look after him. A doctor who lived in this small village. A man who practiced medicine but also possessed a deep love for art. His name was Paul Gauguin. Dr. Gachet did not resemble the typical image of a doctor of that era. He was thin, slightly stooped, and often appeared thoughtful. His face carried a faint sadness, like that of someone who had spent many hours reflecting on life. His house was filled with books, prints, and paintings. He knew many artists in Paris, and had collected works by several contemporary painters. Vincent met Gachet only a few days after arriving in the village. They spoke at length in the doctor's study, where light from the window fell across a desk scattered with papers and drawings. Vincent quickly felt that he was speaking with someone who understood art. Yet he also sensed something else. In a letter to Theo, Vincent wrote that Dr. Gachet seems to be as ill as I am. It was not entirely a criticism. It sounded more like a quiet observation, filled with sympathy between two men who each carried their own unnamed sadness. Vincent rented a small room on the top floor of the Ravoux Inn, a simple lodging house near the center of the village. The room was very small, just large enough for a narrow bed, a wooden table, and a chair. The ceiling was low, and the walls were almost bare. But Vincent had not come to Auvers to remain indoors. What mattered to him were the open fields surrounding the village. Within a few minutes of walking, he could carry his easel out among the wheat fields. Dirt paths crossed the land, the rooftops of Auvers appeared scattered in the distance, and the wide sky stretched above everything. Unlike the blazing light of Arles, the light in Auvers was softer, sometimes touched with gray. Yet this softness lent the landscape a quiet, reflective beauty. In Auvers, Vincent worked with a speed that seemed almost impossible. In just over 2 months, he painted more than 70 works. Nearly every day he carried his easel into the fields. In the morning, he painted when the light was still gentle. In the afternoon, he returned as the sky began to change color. The wheat fields, the narrow roads, and the small houses of Auvers appeared again and again on his canvases. Vincent's brushstrokes during this period became faster and more forceful. The clouds in his paintings often seemed to move in great swirling currents across the sky. The wheat fields tremble as if stirred by wind. It is as though Vincent were not only painting the landscape, but also trying to capture the rhythm of movement in the world around him. One of his best-known paintings from this period is Portrait of Dr. Gachet. In the painting, the doctor sits at a table, his head slightly tilted and his elbow resting on the surface before him. His face carries an expression of quiet fatigue and reflection. Beside him lies a branch of foxglove, the plant used to produce heart medicine. The portrait does more than record the image of a physician. It also seems to mirror something of Vincent's own state of mind. The days in Auvers brought Vincent a temporary sense of calm. In several letters to Theo, he wrote that painting the wide fields helped steady his thoughts. Standing among the wheat and looking up at the vast sky, Vincent sometimes felt that he could breathe more easily. Yet that calm was never entirely secure. Vincent continued to worry about his brother. Theo was now facing difficulties in his work and his health had begun to weaken. Vincent knew that for many years Theo had supported him both financially and emotionally. The thought that he might become a burden weighed heavily on him. In Vincent's paintings from Auvers, the wheat fields appear again and again. In some canvases, narrow paths run through the fields and then vanish suddenly. In others, the sky grows heavier as flocks of birds cross overhead. Later viewers would often feel that these final paintings carried a quiet sense of unease. Vincent continued working with intense concentration. Each day he carried his easel out into the fields. Each day he tried to capture the shifting light, the changing colors, and the wide sky above Auvers. It was almost as if he were trying to hold each moment before it slipped away. The wide wheat fields surrounding the village gradually became the most familiar landscape in his paintings. The dirt road cutting through seas of golden grain, the vast sky above, and the birds crossing the fields would appear again and again on his canvases during the final days of that summer. Chapter 13. Wheatfield with Crows, a painting that feels like farewell. In the final days of July 1890, the countryside around Auvers-sur-Oise entered the most radiant moment of summer. The wheat fields were nearly ready for harvest, the tall stalks heavy beneath the sunlight. When the wind passed through them, the entire field moved in waves of gold, like a vast sea stretching toward the horizon. For Vincent van Gogh, these fields had become a familiar landscape during his final weeks in Auvers. He often walked beyond the edge of the village, carrying his easel and paint box. Villagers sometimes saw him along the narrow dirt road leading into the fields. His wide-brimmed hat shielded him from the sun. His tall, thin figure moved slowly through the sea of wheat. Vincent did not paint these fields as still landscapes. His brushstrokes made them seem alive with motion. The wheat bent in the wind. The clouds turned and swirled across the sky. Dirt paths cut through the fields, giving the sense that nature itself was constantly shifting. The places Vincent chose to paint were often very quiet. When he walked far enough into the fields, the village behind him nearly disappeared. Only the vast sky above and the narrow paths through the wheat remained. It was there that Vincent began working on a painting that would later become one of the most famous images of his entire career. The painting is called Wheatfield with Crows. The scene in the painting is simple. A wide yellow wheat field stretches beneath a deep blue sky. Several dirt paths run across the field in different directions. Yet none of them leads clearly anywhere. One path ends abruptly in the middle of the field. Another bends away toward the side. The paths seem to disappear into the sea of wheat. Above the field, the sky fills nearly half of the canvas. The sky is not bright blue. It feels dense and heavy, pressing downward toward the horizon. Across that sky, dark crows move in flight. Vincent painted them with quick, sharp strokes of black. They do not fly in a single formation. Some rise upward, some cross sideways, some seem to dive toward the field below. These birds are among the elements that give the painting its unsettling feeling. They are small, yet their presence makes the sky seem restless and unstable. The brushwork throughout the painting is strong and thick. The wheat field is built from short strokes of yellow placed tightly together. These lines make the entire field vibrate as if the wind were passing through it. Many years later, when people look at this painting, they often feel that it carries the mood of a farewell. The path without a destination. The heavy sky above. The crows crossing the field. Together they create an atmosphere that is difficult to explain, both open and uneasy at the same time. But we do not know exactly what Vincent was thinking when he painted it. In the final letters he wrote to Theo van Gogh, Vincent still spoke often about his work. He wrote that the wide wheat fields around Auvers gave him a feeling that was both sorrowful and peaceful. For Vincent, a landscape was never simply something to look at. It was something to feel. The open fields, the narrow paths, and the vast sky above seemed to reflect his inner state in ways that were difficult to explain. Perhaps it was that sense of vastness that drew him there. And in Auvers, he had endless chances to paint it. Standing in the middle of the fields, Vincent could see the sky stretching wide above him and the small roads running outward in different directions. Few people passed through these places. There was only the wind, the fields, and the sky. Sometimes Vincent stood still for a long time before beginning to paint. Perhaps he was studying the light. Perhaps he was waiting for the wind to shift. Or perhaps he was simply standing there, surrounded by a landscape too wide to ever fully capture on canvas. In the final days of July, the wheat fields of Auvers were ready for harvest. The stalks had grown tall and deep gold beneath the summer sun. When the wind strengthened, the entire field moved like an immense golden cloth rippling across the land. Vincent continued carrying his easel into the fields each day. He continued painting the sky, the dirt roads, and the vast wheat fields. It was as if he were trying to preserve everything he saw before the light of summer began to change. And in those same fields, only a few days after completing his final paintings, the life of Vincent van Gogh would reach its final moment. A moment that had already been mentioned at the beginning of this story. In the middle of a wide wheat field beneath the summer sky of Auvers. Chapter 14. The Death of Vincent van Gogh, The Final Hours. The final hours of Vincent van Gogh began in a silence that was almost complete. News of what had happened in the wheat field spread through the village of Auvers-sur-Oise that same evening. A few villagers gathered outside the inn speaking quietly, trying to assemble scattered fragments of information into a clear story. They knew that the red-haired painter who had been living in the village for several weeks had been badly wounded. But no one truly knew what had happened out in the fields. Inside the auberge Ravou, everything moved much more slowly. Vincent lay on the bed, his breathing growing heavier as the hours passed. The village doctor had examined the wound. Yet there was little he could do. The bullet was lodged deep inside Vincent's chest. Surgery was nearly impossible under the conditions of a small village at the end of the 19th century. The people in the inn understood that all they could do now was wait. That same night, a telegram was sent to Paris. The message was addressed to Vincent's younger brother, Theo van Gogh. When Theo received the news, he left Paris immediately and traveled to Auvers. For many years, he had been the person closest to his brother. The two men had exchanged hundreds of letters, writing to one another about painting, about life, about hope and disappointment. Vincent painted. Theo worked in the art trade. Yet between them, there had always been a deep bond. The next morning, Theo arrived in Auvers. He climbed the inn's narrow staircase and entered the small room where Vincent lay. The air in the room was quiet. Light from the window fell across the worn wooden floor. Vincent was still conscious. When he saw his brother, he recognized him immediately. During the hardest years of his life, Theo had always stood beside him. When almost no one cared about Vincent's paintings, Theo believed that his brother was doing something meaningful. The two brothers remained together in that small room. Very little from their conversation was recorded. Those who were present later said that Vincent spoke only a little. He grew weaker, yet he remained lucid for many hours. Theo sat beside the bed. Sometimes Vincent spoke a few short words. Sometimes he simply lay in silence. Outside the window, the life of the village continued as usual. People walked along the narrow roads. The fields beyond the village still lay beneath the summer sun. But inside the room, on the upper floor of the inn, time seemed to move more slowly. Night came. Theo remained beside his brother. Vincent's breathing became more difficult. The doctors could do little except try to keep him comfortable. Theo understood that the final hours were approaching. One of the last sentences that would later be remembered was this: "The sadness will last forever." We do not know exactly when Vincent spoke those words. Yet for many people later, the sentence seemed to echo something essential about his life. A life filled with effort and hope, yet also marked by shadows he carried within himself. In the early morning of July 29th, 1890, Vincent's breathing slowly grew weaker. Theo remained beside him. And at last, Vincent van Gogh died at the age of 37. During his lifetime, Vincent created more than 2,000 works, oil paintings, drawings, and sketches. Yet at the moment of his death, very few people knew them. Most of his paintings remained in his studio or in Theo's care. To the art world of that time, he was almost unknown. After Vincent died, his body was laid out in the same room where he had spent the final weeks of his life. Friends and painters from Paris came to Auvers for the funeral. Inside the room, Vincent's paintings were placed against the walls around the coffin: fields, swirling skies, sunflowers. The landscapes he had painted throughout his life now stood quietly around him. Vincent's funeral was simple. He was buried in the small cemetery of the village of Auvers. His grave lay on a hillside overlooking the surrounding countryside. From that place, one could see the landscapes he had painted during the final weeks of his life. Theo van Gogh stood beside the grave of his brother. But the story of the two brothers would almost end at the same moment. Only 6 months after Vincent's death, Theo also died at the age of 33. The two men were later buried side by side in the cemetery of Auvers. Throughout his life, Vincent van Gogh had remained almost unknown. His paintings were rarely exhibited. Very few people understood what he had been trying to do with color, light, and the powerful movement of his brush. But the story of Vincent van Gogh did not end in the cemetery of Auvers. The paintings remained. The letters between the two brothers remained. And in the years that followed, the world slowly began to see what Vincent had left behind. Chapter 15. From Failure to Legend. The Journey of Vincent van Gogh, Becoming a Legend. When Vincent van Gogh died in the summer of 1890, the art world paid little attention to his passing. During his life, Vincent had painted hundreds of canvases and created thousands of drawings. Yet at the time of his death, most of those works remained in his studio, in the small rooms where he had lived, or in the care of his brother, Theo van Gogh. Very few people had ever seen them. In the galleries of Paris, other names were drawing far greater attention. The art market remained focused on established painters. Vincent's works, with their thick brush strokes, powerful colors, and turbulent skies seemed too unusual for the taste of many viewers at that time. So when Vincent van Gogh died, almost no one imagined that his name would one day become one of the most familiar in the history of painting. Yet Vincent's story did not end in the summer of 1890. Only 6 months after his brother's death, Theo van Gogh also passed away at the age of 33. His health had already been fragile, and Vincent's death seemed to hasten his decline. Vincent's paintings, along with the hundreds of letters exchanged between the two brothers, were now inherited by Theo's wife. Her name was Johanna van Gogh Bonger. When Johanna came into possession of Vincent's paintings and letters, she was still in her 20s and raising a young child. Yet in the years that followed, she began doing something few people would have expected. She decided to introduce Vincent's art to the world. It was not an easy task. The art market at that time still did not fully understand Vincent's paintings. Many people continued to see them as strange or excessively intense. But Johanna was patient. She organized small exhibitions. She lent Vincent's paintings to galleries. And perhaps most importantly, she began publishing the letters between Vincent and Theo. Those letters allowed the world to see Vincent van Gogh as a person for the first time. His thoughts, his hopes, and the pain he carried throughout his life. Through those pages, readers began to understand that Vincent was not simply an eccentric painter living in isolation. He was someone who thought deeply about art, about nature, and about human life. Gradually, Vincent's paintings began to receive attention. Young painters across Europe saw in his work an entirely new way of using color. His powerful brushstrokes and radiant fields of paint began to influence a new generation of artists. At the beginning of the 20th century, exhibitions of Vincent van Gogh's paintings began appearing in major European cities. The works that had once been dismissed as strange were now seen differently. People began to recognize a unique force within them. The swirling skies of the starry night, the blazing yellow flowers of the sunflower series, the wide fields in Wheatfield with crows. These images gradually became symbols of modern art. One detail is often repeated when people speak about Vincent's life. During his lifetime, he is believed to have sold only one painting. That painting was The Red Vineyard. It was sold in 1890 during an exhibition in Brussels. At the time, no one could have imagined that only a few decades later, Vincent's paintings would hang in the greatest museums in the world. Today, the works of Vincent van Gogh can be found in museums in Paris, Amsterdam, New York, London, and many other cities. Millions of people stand before them each year. Paintings that were once created in small rented rooms in the quiet halls of a mental hospital or in the middle of wheat fields have become an essential part of the history of art. The name Vincent van Gogh is now linked to something he never witnessed during his lifetime: recognition. Yet perhaps what makes Vincent's story truly remarkable is not only that the world eventually discovered his paintings. It is the way he painted them. Vincent worked quickly, forcefully, almost without hesitation. He tried to capture the light of the sky, the movement of wind across the fields, and the colors of flowers beneath the sun. He painted the world as though every moment mattered. Even today, when people stand before the paintings of Vincent van Gogh, they often feel that sense of urgency. The thick brushstrokes, the radiant colors, the skies filled with motion. They give viewers the feeling of seeing the world through Vincent's eyes. And if one day you find yourself standing on the small hillside of the cemetery in Auvers-sur-Oise, where Vincent van Gogh is buried, you can look out across the countryside. The fields still stretch below. Narrow roads still wind through the seas of golden wheat. And the wide sky above still drifts slowly across the summer. It is the landscape Vincent once saw, the landscape he painted. And in some quiet way, that landscape still carries a part of his story. If you have followed this story all the way here tonight, thank you for taking the time to listen. If slow historical stories like this bring a little peace to your evening, like a subscription or a small comment will help these stories continue to be told. But for now, let the story close where it once began. A summer afternoon, a wide wheat field, the wind moving softly through golden grain, and the sky drifting slowly above Auvers-sur-Oise.